Taruflavan, good evening. So, the brief from Vodafone was the style of presentation for this leadership summit is TED Talk, meaning no scripted speeches. I was saying to Sarsulu that it was very unfair that as the Fiame, he got to read out his script. But those of us speaking tonight have to rely on our memory. And you know, at our age, it's getting a bit challenging. But nevertheless, thank you very much for this invitation. Very happy to participate in this first leadership summit by Vodafone. So my topic is importance of diversity in leadership. I could make a really short statement and just say, well, thank goodness for diversity. Otherwise, I wouldn't be the Prime Minister of Samoa. Because all the other guys, the 6 before me, were all men. And we could have continued on in that way. So, I suppose being invited to speak on diversity, the perhaps most obvious factor then is the gender factor. So I thought I'd spend a little time speaking on the gender factor. It's been said, especially in my field of work, where there are very few women representatives in the Pacific parliaments. In fact, the Pacific region has the lowest level of representation by women in the world. And it really hasn't changed that much. But in the early days of the discourse around gender equality, one of the indicators for lower or higher levels of participation by women in politics was the state of the economy of the countries. So if the economy is an indicator of women's participation in politics, then we could say in the Pacific, the state of the economy is not high. So when this discourse started to happen, and there might be some of you in the room who are old enough to remember the Decade for Women, which concluded in 1985. So from 75 to 1985, the world we're looking into the whole issue of gender equality. And the arguments for, and this is where I suppose the diversity factor comes in, why more women should be participating, is that it's a fuller utilization of the human resource. Now 50% of the population. Women bring in different perspectives. They bring in different skill sets. And also, they may have different approaches. So, coming back to this point about the utilization of human resources, I had the opportunity to travel to Rwanda last year for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And those of you in the room may recall that in the mid-90s, 94, 95, there was that genocide in Rwanda where close to 1 million people were killed. I regret that I had not done more reading on Rwanda before I went, but I had a particular picture in my mind of what Rwanda might be, having visited other countries in Africa, and also countries that had had experiences of civil war or genocide. So I expected an underdeveloped country, but when we arrived in Rwanda, it looked like a developed country. And in terms of the hosting of this Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the facility world class. Hello, this is happening. Were world class. And they had all the, the hotels, the international hotels that were there. People actually walked around, and noticeably women walking around at times by themselves. Now, there are many countries, not just in Africa, where women can't walk around by themselves, but in Rwanda, that's what they were doing. So, of course, we did know, or I did know, in terms of the representation by women in parliaments, I did know Rwanda had a very high representation of women in their government, in their parliaments. And I had this in my mind, perhaps all the men had been in the genocide, and perhaps, that just left the women. But then, did some quick reading, talked to some of the locals. And what became apparent was in coming together, reaching reconciliation, the country really looked at the resource that they had, which was, of course, their human resource. So they were utilizing women and young people. So that was a great example and demonstration for me of how a country embraces not only the human, not only the human resource, but the diversity in that human resource. Now, you might have noticed that I'm wearing trousers, and my shirt looks like it's not buttoned up straight, because when I was getting my mic put on, my helper said, "Oh, your shirt's not buttoned up right." And I said, "No, sorry, that's what I wanted." So, that's one element of diversity, that people are different. And talking about, I don't know, style, fashion, or whatever. I mean, look at Salisulu, he's wearing his white suit. So immediately you know he's a Fiame, especially with the length of his laba. And we get captured into those boxes, and if you're not wearing the right thing, you're not really sort of well accepted. So I wanted to talk a little bit about diversity because it says here the importance of diversity in leadership. So I've talked about the gender element. You know, the quest for women to play more leadership roles. And, you know, in 1962, when we became independent, we were fortunate through our constitution to have the assurances of the basic human rights for all of us. So we have that base. The practice doesn't necessarily come through. And, you know, the question is, why? Why is it that our societies, just talking on gender, have, you know, not embraced women and their participation in leadership? And of course we can say it's social norms, it's how the world is organized, it's been the way things have been done, that women have, you know, particular roles, but leadership, and especially public leadership, which is my field, is certainly not something for women. That for women, their lot in life is the domestic side. And I don't deny, and we all know, how much women carry the domestic role. And coming back to my point about the state of the economy, because the higher the economy, the more services become available, you know, that can assist women with their basic roles: mothering, looking after the family, making sure the kids get vaccinated, go to school, do the washing, the cooking, dinner for the husband, and all those sorts of things. But with more developed and evolved economies, as we can see in other countries, there are services available that can supplement or complement the traditional roles that women play. One of the things that I have seen, especially being in politics, is that we have a constitution that provides us with, you know, the rights and the protections, but we don't necessarily take them up. And I want to share a personal story about when I got my Thai title, Fiame. My dad had passed away in my last year at high school. I was in New Zealand. He had 3 titles, so of course those titles became vacant when he passed away. So the 3 families, all the time, went to arbitration at the Lands and Titles Court. I was claiming for 2 of the titles, the Fomwina title and the Fiame title. And I recall, as most of you will know about how we operate at the Lands and Titles Court, we have no lawyers. We go in there with our party and make our presentation and defend our presentation to the bench. It was quite notable that the bench, which were all Samoans, except for the president, who was a Parliament from New Zealand, it became very apparent through their questions, body language, and so forth, that they didn't think that I was a suitable candidate. So that was for the first court case, which was the Fiame case. Then we came to the second case, which is the Fiame title. Similar bench, same Palangi president. Also the same. Judges not very happy, didn't really think I was suitable. That was 1977 when I was 20, so you can do the math, see how old I am now. And it came down to the fact that I was female, the fact that I was young, and the third fact was that I was unmarried. I was 20, for goodness sake. Of course I'd be unmarried. But unmarried seemed to suggest somehow that, you know, this was a risky person because they didn't, you know, have that status. Anyway, what happened was that there were 13 candidates for the title. And if the other candidates had a long time been interrogated by the court, maybe half an hour. When it came to my party and my turn, we had all of the morning session and half of the afternoon session being interrogated, and mostly me, by the judges. And I suppose it was a strategy that I was engaging the judges so that we could have, you know, a longer interchange. So we were having this sort of almost a competition thing running. But what I want, really the point I'm wanting to make with this story is that when the bench came back, and we had every expectation, like the first case, of the Fiame case, that I would not be appointed because of the attitude of the bench. But to our surprise, they came back and they said, okay, Naomi can have the title. At that time, the parties were able to access the record of the deliberation of the bench. And what appeared there was, it was true, most of the San Juan judges did not support my candidature. And it was in fact the president of the court who vetoed on the grounds that they could not disqualify my candidature on the basis that I was female, that I was young, and that I was unmarried. So, the other point I wanted to underscore with this story is that we can be privileged and enjoy, you know, the rights that are enshrined in our Constitution. But if we don't actually use them or argue on the basis of them, then, you know, if it's diversity that we're wanting to achieve, it won't happen if we don't work our advantages. And there are, of course, many other advantages, but this was just an example. So, I go to international meetings, and they always talk about how important diversity is. And it's really about big country versus small countries, rich countries versus poor countries, but how we're all equal sitting around the table. But that we want diversity in terms of the echelons that are developed through those organizations that is representational of the diversity of countries around the world. So, in countries like New Zealand, Australia, US, Canada, those countries that were settled from other places, mostly European, and more latterly from Asia and other continents. You understand, the argument for diversity because they're all different. But, it's a good discussion for us to have here in Samoa. What does diversity look like to us? Samoan-looking people, tall people, short people, men, women. Because, those are all the different things that you hear when there is discussion around diversity. Gender, age, place, your status, your religion, whether your interests are business, whether you're a rural person or an urban person, whether you're a Samoan from the village or whether you're a Samoan from the village, or whether you're a Samoan that's made the return back from overseas and trying to settle back in. So, as a new government, it's an opportunity, I think, to review those sorts of things. We just received the report from the Electoral Commission inquiry, and that's always been a really interesting exercise because it's trying to build a system that draws in differing, diverse sectors of our society into something that speaks to everyone, could have fairness in there, and most importantly, of course, the best representation of the people of Samoa. And there are discussions around, so what's the basis, that we build this electoral system on, where there are differing elements in our society? Do we go back to where we started with the traditional districts? Do we look at population? Do we look at islands? And these are all the questions that I think are good demonstrations of diversity and how we as leaders make decisions about those. One of the other things that always piqued my thinking on diversity is that it usually comes along with unity. Unity in diversity. So, if you look at the two different words, they're quite disparate and meaning opposite things. And yet, the discourse around diversity almost always has unity, as a chaser. And, for organizations, for governments, that is the question. If we acknowledge diversity or differences, how do we bring that to a place of unity? And then, of course, it then comes down, what is the common interest? But I think one of the basic things about, the disparateness between these two words, diversity and and unity is that I think fundamentally it's seeking one, acknowledgement and recognition. That, if we are people, we are different, and so forth. I think what basically everyone is looking for in that discourse is, here I am, do you recognize me? Do you acknowledge me? How do we recognize people and how do we acknowledge them? In the midst of that diversity, but wanting also, in what is very common, I think, to our humanity, is that we do live together. Okay, how am I doing? Is anyone keeping time? So I know that Jennifer, I think, who's the next speaker, is going to, give us elements of leadership. So I won't sort of go into that. But I think one of the things I wanted to say in this particular discussion on diversity, whether there's diversity or no diversity, the leadership still takes place in context, and that is really important. You don't just take your your leadership ideas and apply them, and not taking account of the context in which you operate. So that's just a very quick point. One of the last things I wanted to say about leadership, and leading up to Jennifer's presentation, is that as a leader, what I think is really important for us, whether we're looking into this diversity issue, looking at how to manage stress, looking at how we use technology and the digital world that we're all in now, is that there are still some very basic tenets, and I'd just like to share them, and Jennifer might well come up with the same thing. I think it's really important for leaders to be very clear on what their value base is, or perhaps I could say, that they have a moral compass intact. I think it's very important for leaders to be self-aware about who they are, how they interact with the environment around them, whether that be human interaction with the physical environment, and of course, in Samoa, our spiritual environment. I think it's critical for leaders to engage and commit. It's not a distant business. You don't operate remotely. And if you do, then I think, you're not going down the right path. I think it's very important for leaders to be enablers, to make things work, to help people, and so forth. And I suppose the most basic, the critical element of leaders is that at some point, or at many points, you have to make that call. And the buck stops with you. Sometimes, issues can just be let to float. No decisions are made. There are some management thought that sometimes there's just some issues, if you just leave them, in your reading tray. It will fix itself sometime. Well, I don't know how it works for you, but most of the time it comes back to bite you if you're not paying attention and making decisions on it. My concluding remark is that what is diversity? And I think I've alluded to acknowledgement and recognition. But I think the basic thought is I'd like to leave with you. Diversity in leadership is the right thing to do. But thank you.